On the evening of June 5th, 1944, the atmosphere was particularly tense and uneasy. The weather in Normandy had taken a harsh turn, displaying its more formidable side. Throughout the day, relentless rain poured down alongside gusty high winds, adding to the bleakness. I was seated in a sparse, modest house on the outskirts of the village of Belangeville, a few kilometers west of Vimont and east of Cannes, a significant industrial hub and port city along the Normandy coast. Spread out before me were documents and maps, meticulously laid out for the exercises I was preparing for my regiment. My adjutant, Lieutenant Helmut Libeskind, was operating at the command post located within the village itself. I was 32 years old, holding the rank of major, with an impending promotion to lieutenant colonel scheduled for the end of July. After another couple of months, I was to be promoted once again to the rank of colonel. The rapid pace of my advancement felt almost surreal, especially considering how the often unpredictable weather played a crucial role in planning military operations. Each day, naval meteorologists carefully predicted conditions, which were then transmitted to us by division headquarters. Their forecasts had cleared us for the 5th and 6th of June, leading us to believe that large-scale amphibious landings were unlikely because the weather was expected to be unfavorable for such operations. Heavy seas, storms, and low-lying clouds would have rendered any sizable assault by sea or air impossible for our enemies. That evening, I found my situation increasingly frustrating. Like most of my men, I was accustomed to swift, mobile actions. Combat engagements in other theatres of the war had often required rapid manoeuvring. Now we faced an unusual period of suspense, waiting for the inevitable invasion, which we knew was approaching. Despite the prolonged waiting and the inactivity it entailed, the morale among our troops remained remarkably high. To our relief, Normandy had been generous, providing plentiful supplies of butter, cheese, crème fraîche, and meat, along with cider, which helped sustain us through this period of uncertainty. As night fell on that rainy evening, my adjutant and I anticipated a report from the 2nd Battalion, which had just completed its night exercise. They were operating in the area around Tron-Escoville, relatively close to the coast. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion, equipped with armoured personnel carriers and half-track vehicles, had taken up waiting positions further inland. I had issued a basic but firm order. In the event of an attempted landing by Allied commandos, our battalions and companies were authorized to attack immediately and independently, without waiting for prior clearance from the highest authority, unless directed otherwise by command. Given the weather forecast, which predicted stormy conditions and low clouds, I had no real expectation of an imminent attack that night. Suddenly, around midnight, the distant but unmistakable roar of aircraft pierced the darkness. I wondered whether these planes were again targeting inland traffic routes, or if they were heading straight for German-held territory itself. Due to the fog and low clouds, the aircraft appeared to be flying at very low altitude. I stared out the window, fully alert. Flares flickered faintly in the sky, casting an ominous glow. At that moment, my adjutant received a call from the command post. "Major, paratroopers are dropping. Gliders are landing in our sector. I am trying to make contact with 2nd Battalion." Without hesitation, I ordered an immediate alert for all units. The division was to be informed that 2nd Battalion was to engage wherever necessary. Prisoners should be captured if possible and brought to me. I then hurried to the command post with my adjutant, where the 5th Company of 2nd Battalion was already out in position, ready for the unpredictable events that had suddenly begun to unfold. Although our supplies of blank cartridges had not yet arrived from the previous night's exercises, the situation on the battlefield was becoming perilous. Initial reports indicated that British paratroopers had descended over Tron, creating a dangerous and unpredictable scenario. The commander of the 2nd Battalion had already initiated a counterattack, even utilizing troops who were not directly involved in the initial engagement, and had managed to push their forces as far as Tron, where elements of the 5th Company had begun to withdraw under their own initiative. In response, we immediately contacted the company commander, who was sheltering in a cellar in Brandenburg. We informed him that the battalion was already engaging the enemy and would likely reach his location in a matter of moments. He confirmed that he understood and added that he had already taken a prisoner, a British medical officer from the 6th Airborne Division. We asked him to send this prisoner to us as soon as their position was stabilized. Meanwhile, my adjutant made a brief call to the divisional headquarters, where General Feuchtinger and his staff officers had yet to return. We handed a short situation report to Lieutenant Messmer, the orderly officer, and requested him to seek permission for a coordinated night attack. We hoped that, once the divisional commander arrived, we might be authorized to strike swiftly, taking advantage of the initial disarray among our opponents. By this point, our understanding of the overall situation had improved somewhat. Prisoners who had either misjudged their jumps or fallen into our hands during our limited counter-offensive were brought to me. Some of these prisoners were on parachutes, and despite their capture, they maintained a composure typical of British troops, although their demeanour betrayed a sense of disappointment and anxiety at being taken prisoner so early in their mission. According to orders, these prisoners were to be handed over to division headquarters once they were processed. Through casual conversation, I learned that the 6th Airborne Division was scheduled for a nighttime jump, intended to seize the bridges over the Orne River at Ronville and secure the former bridgehead east of the river in preparation for a seaborne landing planned for the morning of June 6th. Growing increasingly frustrated, we waited in vain for authorization to launch an immediate night attack. We recognized the strategic advantage of striking swiftly to capitalize on the initial chaos among the enemy, but the clearance for such an action had still not been granted. Despite having sent reports through our division to both the Corps and Army Group B, as well as Rommel himself, the necessary orders had not yet arrived. Meanwhile, we carefully assessed the likelihood of successfully breaking through the enemy lines to reach the coast, aiming either to prevent the establishment of a stronghold or at least to complicate their efforts. I vividly recall the British medical officer who was brought to me as the first prisoner. He was still in his parachute gear, appearing much like any other soldier, demonstrating the typical British composure. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, he seemed visibly disappointed and unsettled by his sudden capture. He, like the others, would only give his name and a number, refusing to provide further details. As was our custom, I began by engaging him in small talk, mentioning my last visit to London in March of 1939, recalling Piccadilly Circus and British acquaintances I had made. Through such conversation, I aimed to gather more insight into British intentions and the objectives of the 6th Airborne Division. Hours slipped by as we remained in a defensive posture, effectively immobilized and awaiting further orders. Our entire division, including the Panzer Regiment and Panzer Grenadier Regiment 192, was similarly immobilized but kept in a state of high alert. My adjutant made another attempt to contact division headquarters, calling Major Foster, who answered the telephone but was also unable to modify the established deployment instructions. We were left in limbo, with only the knowledge that Army Group B had provided us with minimal information, merely indicating that they were aware of the situation but offering no specific directives. At dawn, the British launched a deceptive tactic by deploying dummy parachutists, dangling from parachutes, creating a diversion. Meanwhile, I dispatched my adjutant to the divisional command post, urgently requesting immediate approval for a counterattack upon the general's arrival. I observed Lieutenant Lieb participating in a tense telephone conversation with the Army's commanding general, who was evidently engaged in a fervent discussion with Feuchtinger. Having recently returned from Paris, I had witnessed a colossal armada off the west coast of Cobourg, comprising warships, supply vessels, and landing craft. This sight convinced me that an immediate offensive, aimed at the entire division positioned east of the Orne, would be the optimal course of action to break through towards the coast. However, our request for clearance was outrightly denied. Meanwhile, Hitler, who often worked late into the night, was still asleep at that early morning hour at the command post. I paced back and forth, clenched my fists in frustration at the Supreme Command's indecision, despite the clear and urgent facts at hand. If Rommel had been present with us instead of being in Germany, he would have likely overridden all orders and taken decisive action, a conviction we all shared. We felt physically prepared and confident in our ability to handle the situation. I concealed my mounting frustration, maintaining a calm and pragmatic exterior. My past experience in various theatres of war had taught me that in the most critical and alarming moments, experienced leaders must remain composed. To calm a highly agitated orderly officer or a dispatch rider bringing news from a seemingly desperate situation, the best approach was to sit him down, offer a cigarette, and calmly ask, "Please, tell me what actually happened." The tragic course of events unfolded quickly. Within a few hours, the brave units defending the coastal fortifications were overwhelmed, either unable to withstand the relentless enemy pressure or shattered under the devastating fire from Allied naval guns. Behind the front, a German panzer division, ready to engage, lay motionless, while powerful Allied bomber formations, benefiting from complete air superiority, targeted the coastal divisions with precise, concentrated attacks in the early morning hours. From the hills east of Caen, we watched the enormous Allied fleet, the fields scattered with transport gliders and numerous observation balloons hovering over the landing fleet, which used heavy naval guns to deliver precise and devastating fire upon us. Faced with this overwhelming superiority, we were compelled to regroup. Strong combat units were formed on either side of the Orne, east and west, while we continued to await authorization to launch a counterattack. Observing the landing fleet, I realized that the prospects of pushing the Allies back into the sea had diminished greatly. Mobilizing reserves was becoming increasingly difficult once the second front had been established. The enemy in the east was pressing forward with superior strength, accompanied by relentless bombing campaigns targeting our vital industrial centers and railway lines. Even the most brave and experienced troops no longer appeared capable of turning the tide and winning this war. I believed that a successful invasion by the Allies marked not just a setback, but the beginning of our final decline. What we did not realize at that moment was that, at the start of May 1987, certain crucial information had already fallen into my hands. Werner Kortenhaus, a former tank commander in our division and the author of History of the 21st Panzer Division, shared with me 2 letters that had been sent to him at the end of 1979. One of these was an excerpt from a letter dated the 26th of October that year, written by General Speidel, who had formerly served as Chief of Staff for Army Group B. In the early hours of the 6th of June, 1944, I tried to reach Feutinger between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, but was unable to contact him. It was only later, during the morning of that same day, that my Chief of Staff succeeded in getting through. At that time, Feutinger had received a general directive instructing him to attack immediately in the event of an airborne landing. An extract from Speidel's letter, dated the 15th of November, 1979, reveals that the 21st Panzer Division had been ordered to mobilize and intervene without delay should an airborne assault occur. This order was to be carried out in full strength with the entire division, which meant deploying my entire combat group during the very night of the 5th to the 6th of June, if such an airborne operation was launched. However, neither I nor my adjutant at the time who later became General Libeskind of the Bundeswehr, was aware of this directive during the critical night. It appears that other units within the division were also unaware of the order, as all personnel strictly adhered to the protocol of not executing any operations until receiving explicit clearance from Army Group B. The division's staff must have known of this order, as indicated in Speidel's correspondence. This leads to an important question. If I had been aware of the order to act promptly in the event of an airborne landing, I would have, on my own authority, launched a full-scale attack with the entire regiment, reinforced by the Becker Assault Gun Battalion, against the enemy forces landing east of the Orne. I am convinced, both myself and my adjutant, that exploiting the initial disarray among the enemy following their descent could have enabled us to push through to the coast and possibly recapture the 2 bridges over the Orne at Bénouville. Such actions, combined with parallel operations by the 1902nd Regiment and the Panzer Regiment, might not have stopped the invasion altogether, but could have delayed the seaborne landings significantly, resulting in heavy losses for the British forces. This example vividly illustrates how imprecise or incomplete issuance of orders can negatively impact an entire military operation. Furthermore, at the beginning of June in 1987, I came into possession of additional, highly interesting information. It was provided by a former captain of the General Staff, who later became General Wagnermann of the Bundeswehr. This former officer had entrusted the details to Lieutenant Colonel Berthold, a student of the invasion, during that same period. Between May and July of 1944, Wegmann was assigned to the divisional staff to assist with training duties. During the night of the 5th into the 6th of June, he was acting as the deputy for the division's chief of staff, who was stationed in Paris with Foitinger. Wegmann reported that late on the evening of June 5th, the division's radio unit intercepted a clear-text British message indicating the loading of transport gliders. This information was relayed immediately, following the initial reports of airborne landings. In response, Wegmann took swift action by alerting the entire division and notifying Foitinger in Paris. Sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning of June 6th, Foitinger arrived at the command post accompanied by his general staff officer. By early morning, between 6 and 7 o'clock, all of us were taken aback that Speidel, in a call at 2 o'clock that same morning, despite knowing the overarching directive, had not issued an order to attack the airborne enemy forces with all available units in our sector east of the river. Looking back, it seems inexcusable that the crucial hours were left in the hands of divisional commanders who lacked full information, especially during such a critical moment. On the night spanning June 5th to 6th, Lance Corporal Hamel was assigned to guard duty. He was part of the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21 of our division, which was positioned in reserve near a village south of Calais. Hamel later recalled that the inactivity was frustrating. As scouts and often leading the division's forefront, we were accustomed to constant action. Instead, we had been stationed there for weeks, awaiting orders for an operation that might not even involve us. Following orders from Rommel, we engaged in nightly exercises to familiarize ourselves with the terrain along the coast, preparing for the possibility of airborne landings. Our tasks included setting up Rommel's asparagus defences against gliders and constructing fortifications behind the Atlantic Wall. Suddenly, at midnight on June 5th to 6th, chaos erupted. From my vantage point, I could see flares lighting up the sky, followed by a fierce air raid on the nearby town. My initial thought was that the battle had begun. Lieutenant Ruprecht Kazimek of the Reconnaissance Battalion vividly remembers that night, recalling that alert was sounded due to reports of paratroopers and gliders landing within the sector of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 125 under Major von Luck. Along with the bombing of Calais, this suggested a larger operation than a simple reconnaissance raid. Although the official orders mandated attacking only upon directives from the highest authority, our battalion quickly prepared for action. At that time, our commander, Major Waldo, was on leave and was expected back on June 8th. A liaison officer had been sent to Major von Luck and reported that not only had an airborne division landed east of Calais, but that the enemy also assembled a large fleet off the coast, preparing for a naval landing. Heavy naval guns had now joined the effort, indicating that the enemy's coastal units appeared vulnerable and unprepared for decisive resistance at that moment. Shortly after the fighting began in earnest, an urgent order arrived. Our battalion was now attached to von Luck's combat group and expected to move out immediately toward Tron, a town located roughly 12 kilometers east of Caen. Using the abundant cover available, we advanced cautiously, approaching the area just west of Tron by early afternoon, encountering little interference. As we continued northeast, around midday on June 6th, we observed 2 Messerschmitt fighters flying northward at a low altitude over the plain. That day, the only German aircraft in the vicinity of Caen was a lone fighter, while west of the town, the first British paratroopers had been killed, victims of their own parachute silk, which we had used as makeshift scarves to shield ourselves from dust. At that moment, our commanding officer's deputy issued an order for us to launch an attack. Without hesitation, we surged forward, practically from a standing start. From our position further west, we could hear the sounds of ongoing combat. This noise originated from the area where our armoured units were supposed to strike the enemy. It appeared that the adversary was concentrating naval artillery fire on this sector, posing a significant threat to our attack. Their air force was also actively engaging, making our progress challenging but steady. We pushed on, reaching the outskirts of Esquiville, only a few kilometers from Ronville and the bridges over the Arne River. The morning of June 6th was marked by chaos and confusion, as the situation rapidly evolved amidst the Allied landings. Our command faced a jumble of orders amidst the spectacle of warships, merchant vessels, landing craft, and the imminent sea landings. Despite some broad directives, we had not yet received formal authorization to attack during the night, and even in the early hours our division had yet to be cleared for a counterattack. The Allied landings were misinterpreted by some high command, with many believing they were only diversions. The general consensus among Hitler's high command and the Navy was that the real attack would occur at Calais or nearby ports. Meanwhile, our corps commander, General Marx, believed the landings were authentic. We even heard that Rommel was en route to his headquarters, having not yet met with Hitler. As the night passed into early dawn, it seemed to us that crucial decisions were being delayed, and too late. We were frustrated and angered by the lack of trust from the High Command, which hesitated to authorize immediate action. Ultimately, whether authorized or not, General Marx ordered our division to attack immediately. Without waiting for further instructions, we launched a sweeping assault on the eastern side of the Aisne, targeting the units of the 6th British Airborne Division that had landed there. Our objective was to sever their communication lines with the West, disrupting their defences while the division prepared for a full-scale attack. During this effort, we had to wait for the necessary orders to be officially issued, and for the division to fully mobilise. As our movements unfolded, the scope of the invasion became clearer, especially when enemy aircraft began harassing us acutely. Then, a new directive came from the 7th Army. It mandated that the majority of the 21st Panzer Division was to attack the enemy forces that had landed west of the Aisne. Only selected elements of von Luck's combat group were to assault the bridgehead east of the river. This shift required us to regroup quickly, and the process took hours. Most units positioned east of Caen and along the Aisne had to carefully maneuver through narrow gaps, squeezing through the eye of a needle to reach their respective positions and prepare for the coming fight. In this intense and chaotic battlefield scenario, the fighting in this sector was relentless, with our forces constantly under attack. Caen was subject to near-constant heavy bombardments from the Royal Navy's ships and the fighter-bomber aircraft of the Royal Air Force, creating a brutal and unpredictable environment. Meanwhile, I received specific orders that a reinforced armoured unit, including my battalion equipped with Schützen and Panzerwagen armoured personnel carriers, was to break through toward the coast, located west of the town of Orne. According to my directives, my battalion was to coordinate its assault with additional units. The Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21, Assault Gun Battalion 200, and a platoon of anti-tank guns. Our primary objective was to defeat the 6th Airborne's fragile bridgehead, an enemy position holding a vital crossing, and to retake 2 bridges at Bénouville, with the ultimate goal of establishing contact with the coastal units. To bolster our efforts, artillery units would provide supporting fire, and the attack was to commence as soon as all participating elements arrived in position. My concern about employing the reconnaissance battalion was significant. Having fought in nearly all theatres of the war as an armoured scout, I knew how vital the role was, always as the vanguard for the division. However, this unit was not designed for direct assault operations. The 4th Company of the Panzer Regiment arrived late in the afternoon on the 6th of June, around 5 o'clock, and Major Becker's artillery batteries only reached us the night after, on the 7th of June. This delay left me no choice but to initiate the attack without their direct support. Meanwhile, my 2nd Battalion was engaged in fierce defensive combat against incoming paratroopers who were attempting to expand their already small bridgehead. Only limited elements of the battalion could be spared for the offensive, which we launched in the late afternoon. Our objective was to push through via Esquivel, Hérouvillette and Ronville, targeting the 2 bridges at Bénouville. The reconnaissance battalion advanced directly from its starting position, supported by Panzer Company troops, and penetrated toward Esquivel, catching the enemy by surprise. However, the situation quickly deteriorated. The air was filled with the deafening roar of naval artillery firing shells up to 38 centimeters in caliber, alongside relentless fighter-bomber attacks. These strikes hammered us without pause, leaving radio contact cut off and forcing wounded soldiers and the reconnaissance troops to seek cover. I had advanced with the attack and witnessed the unfolding disaster firsthand. Recognizing the peril, I managed to reach the battalion commander and issued urgent orders. Cease all offensive actions immediately to avoid further heavy losses and take up defensive positions on the southern outskirts of Esquivel. We needed to establish a firm line of defense there to prevent the enemy's further advances. I also directed that 4th Company of the Panzer Regiment, along with Major Becker's assault guns, once they arrived, would support us from the south. I emphasized the importance of ensuring our men and armoured car crews dug in securely to withstand the upcoming enemy assault. As I hurried back to my regiment's radio station, my adjutant, Liebskind, was tasked with relaying the decision to the division that the attack had been broken off, and to prepare for a defensive stance. Simultaneously, Feuchtinger's reports indicated that the armoured group had managed to reach the coast, passing through a gap between the landings of the British 3rd Infantry Division and the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. However, their advance was halted by intense fire from Navy artillery, fighter-bomber strikes, and a fresh push by newly landed paratroopers in the rear. These combined assaults forced the armoured units to withdraw as the enemy sought to prevent encirclement and to weaken our hold on the coastline. My sister regiment, the 1920, took up a defensive position roughly at the same level as ours. The feared scenario that Rommel had anticipated finally materialized. The enemy had not been routed by our entire division, and pushed back into the sea in the initial hours of the landing. Instead, the other two panzer divisions remained positioned far to the rear of the 100 fighters that Goering had promised, and by evening on June the 6th, it seemed even Hitler recognized that a large-scale invasion was underway. Yet, despite this, Hitler and his high command still believed another landing was likely in the area surrounding Calais, and the panzer divisions along with reserve units stationed there were not to be withdrawn, following Hitler's urgent orders. At the same time, it was painfully obvious to everyone that the invasion had succeeded. It was only a matter of days or perhaps weeks before the Allies would land enough forces to threaten Paris and ultimately the German Reich itself. The only obstacle was the relentless supremacy of Allied air power. Night after night, the sky was lit up with Christmas-like illuminations, revealing bright lighting that bathed the entire battlefield. The air bombardments never ceased, pouring down their destructive fury. The Navy also contributed to the chaos, firing barrages on our positions and bombarding the city of Caen, which was a critical hub for our communications. During daylight hours, circumstances worsened dramatically. Any movement on the battlefield, even a single vehicle, provoked a swift, concentrated response from enemy ships or fighter-bomber attacks. Our radio communications were either intercepted or the Navy had divided the area into grid squares, passing on the square numbers that triggered precise and devastating artillery strikes. For protection, we dug foxholes beside our vehicles at night, which offered some relief from the constant danger. All our supplies arrived from Paris and could only be moved under cover of darkness. On the night of June the 7th, I received orders to continue attacking Esquiville over the following days. Our goal remained to crush the small bridgehead east of the Orne, which was still limited in size. The next morning, we saw on the rising ground north of Esquiville nearly 100 gliders resting in the fields, a clear sign that additional units of the 6th Airborne Division had successfully landed. Meanwhile, units from the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion still held positions on the southern outskirts of the village. A combat patrol pushed into Esquiville, suffering heavy casualties but managing to capture 13 prisoners. One of the prisoners spoke, sharing information about their mission: to advance south through the town, expand the bridgehead, and reach our original objective. Back at my command post, I engaged in conversation with an NCO from the 6th Airborne Division. He had been slightly wounded and was in treatment with our medical staff. Despite expressing gratitude for the fair treatment he received, he was clearly bitter. He belonged to B Company under Major John Howard, and their mission was to land at midnight using 6 gliders, targeting the 2 bridges at Orne. Near Bénouville, with the bridges still intact, our unit had been meticulously preparing for this operation for over a year. We landed precisely at the location of the bridges, catching the enemy completely off guard, so much so that they didn't even have time to carry out the carefully planned demolitions. I believe we were the very first troops to set foot on French soil during this campaign. The pride among us was immense, especially considering that our forces had suffered only a few casualties in the initial landing. Major Howard had assured us that, following the success of this operation, we would be transported back to England to prepare for the next mission. However, just last evening, we received new orders. Our major was instructed to lead an attack on the village of Esquiville. By dawn, our small bridgehead was to be expanded, a task that, in my view, wasn't what we had originally been trained or meant for. We managed to push into the village but immediately came under intense fire from all directions, particularly from those infamous German 80mm artillery guns. It seemed that more than half of our company, soldiers, had already been killed, wounded, or captured in this fierce engagement. After the relatively easy resistance at the bridges, facing such a formidable, well-prepared enemy defence was a harsh blow. Despite the chaos, our major remained proud of the Kudama units and was optimistic even amid this disaster. Nonetheless, we were all aware that our initial landing from the sea had been successful, and nothing could stop us from advancing toward Paris. Soon enough, it became clear that the tide of the war was turning against the Germans. Victory was slipping away from us. Today, one of the bridges on our route bears the name Pegasus Bridge, a tribute to the flying horse emblem of the British airborne forces. Meanwhile, reports from our right flank began to come in. 2nd Battalion was engaged in heavy defensive fighting, especially near and north of Tron. It was crucial that the enemy did not break through this unprotected, exposed flank. On June 7th, our commander, Captain Curzon, was killed in action. He was posthumously promoted to Major and awarded the Knight's Cross for his bravery. Lieutenant Brandenburg, with his 5th Company, who was the first to contact the enemy during the night of June 6th, was also killed. Both men were buried behind our lines and later reinterred elsewhere. These losses hit us hard. That same day, all divisions sent Major Court from the reserve to take command of the battalion. An infantryman with experience fighting in Russia, Court was particularly well suited for this immediate task. He quickly adapted and became one of the most reliable and successful leaders of our combat group. By June 8th, we and the British forces had not launched any further attacks. Instead, both sides focused on tending to the wounded and replacing casualties. Unexpectedly, a squadron of Messerschmitt fighters appeared overhead. They engaged in an aerial skirmish that morning, resulting in a Royal Air Force fighter being shot down over the British lines. The soldiers on our side cheered jubilantly, hopeful that the promised 1,000 fighters would arrive to turn the tide of the air battle. Yet, a Messerschmitt was also downed, and its pilot managed to jump with a parachute, landing near our reconnaissance battalion. The pilot was brought to me, visibly angry and waving his arms, asking bitterly what we were supposed to do against such aerial superiority. What had happened to the 1,000 fighters they had promised? Neither we nor the British understood where those fighters were. In the afternoon, Major Waldo returned from leave. His reconnaissance battalion soldiers appreciated his presence since he was well liked, especially because he always stood up for his men and sought to minimize unnecessary losses. At the same time, we received new orders from division. Our combat group was to assemble early on June 9th for a decisive assault on Escoville. The objective was to advance through Randville and secure the bridges of the Orne River. For this operation, we would be reinforced by several units: the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21, the 4th Company of Panzer Regiment 22, 3 batteries from Major Becker's Assault Gun Battalion 200, and 1 company from Anti-Tank Battalion 220, altogether forming a formidable force ready to push back the enemy and secure our strategic positions. That evening, with only 8 centimeters guns available, the division's artillery prepared to support the upcoming assault, limited solely by its supply of ammunition. As night fell, all the commanding officers, accompanied by an artillery observer, gathered at my command post. Our plan was to launch the attack before dawn, aiming to strike before the enemy's air force could intervene or the Navy could become a decisive factor. Leading the advance would be the motorcycle escorts from the Reconnaissance Battalion, along with the Grenadiers of the 2nd Battalion, a move designed to keep ahead of the enemy forces, which were engaged elsewhere and not tied down. Following them, the 1st Battalion would move forward, assisted by tanks from the 4th Company and supported by Becker's specialised SPGWs. To defend against potential counterattacks from British tanks, anti-tank guns took strategic positions atop the hill south of Escoville, providing a crucial defensive line. Overcoming the formidable challenge posed by naval guns and fighter bomber strikes required assembling a robust and well-coordinated combat group. An hour before dawn, I set out with a small command contingent, riding behind the reconnaissance battalion, ready to make on-the-spot decisions as the battle unfolded. During the night, our positions had been heavily bombarded by naval fire and aerial assaults, indicating that our movements had likely been detected. Lance Corporal Hamill, who participated in the attack as part of the motorcycle escort, later recalled how, supported by tanks and assault guns, our forces soon pushed into Escoville. The remaining civilians, including a few children wandering near the church in search of their parents, were evacuated to safety within the church walls. We took immediate steps to protect these vulnerable civilians amid the chaos. The British forces of the 6th Airborne Division fought with fierce determination. As dawn broke, heavy naval fire rained down upon the village's centre and its southern outskirts, halting any further progress on our part. Then, devastating news arrived. Our beloved commander, Major Waldo, had been killed, only a day after returning from being with his wife. This tragic loss struck us all profoundly. Initially, because of the intense barrage, we could not recover his body, which remained exposed amid the fire. It was only after nightfall that a volunteer patrol, permitted to pass by the British, who, in fairness, allowed such access, managed to retrieve Major Waldo's body and bring him back for a proper burial, further behind our lines. Later, the British transferred him to their military cemetery in Ronville, where he was laid to rest among his former enemies, honoured for his sacrifice. Waldo's death left a deep personal impact on me. During our conversations in Paris, I had sensed his contempt for Hitler, and I later learned he was part of the wide circle of resistance within the 20th of July, 1944 conspiracy. I once informed Waldo about Rommel's prophecy, knowing he had also placed his hopes on Rommel's success. Waldo was an officer trained in the traditional Prussian manner, highly decorated during his service in Russia. He was humble and consistently attentive to the well-being of his men. Later, his sister shared with me an incident illustrating his character. During a confrontation in a Russian village surrounded by partisan fighters, the inhabitants hadn't had food for days. In response, Waldo distributed his soldiers' rations among the women and children, demonstrating compassion amid chaos. That night, a partisan delegation appeared, expressing gratitude in German. "You have provided food for our women and children. We thank you. You may leave the village tonight with your men, and we will not attack." This act of humanity was a rare sign of mutual respect amidst the brutality of war. In place of Waldo, Captain Brandt from the reserve of officers assumed command of the reconnaissance battalion. At that time, Werner Kortenhaus, a tank commander in the 4th Company of the 9th of June, faced one of the most harrowing days of her wartime experience. That day marked one of the most challenging operations for our unit. We gathered around 10 tanks beneath the trees along the avenue south of Escoville, advancing with closed hatches. One by one, we moved past the chateau into a large meadow enclosed by hedges, preparing to shift into a broad wedge formation to launch an attack, grenadiers positioned behind and alongside us. Suddenly, chaos erupted within minutes. 4 tanks were destroyed by enemy naval guns. On my tank, a Mark IV with a short barrel, the turret jammed, restricting my firing to only the machine gun aimed into the hedges. The enemy's fire intensified, forcing us, under orders from Major Funlock, to withdraw, as did the grenadiers. The artillery bombardment persisted relentlessly, and it's estimated that perhaps 30 to 40 grenadiers were killed by the shell fire. That evening we realized that our efforts to force the British back into the sea had failed utterly. By 1960, when the ruins of the chateau still stood, I revisited the battlefield to analyze the attack firsthand. It became clear that our assault was doomed from the start. Behind the hedges lay a solid wall, which we could only breach at great risk, potentially damaging our guns. In front of the wall, a ditch provided an ideal defensive position for the enemy. Additionally, the wall contained holes made by artillery shells through which defenders could retreat easily, making it an unfavorable sector for a tank assault. Intelligence from patrols indicated that, on the 8th of June, the 51st Highland Division had been moved into the bridgehead to relieve the exhausted 6th Airborne. This development lowered the chances of successfully pushing back the bridgehead, further complicating our attack. I was familiar with the 51st Highland Division from North Africa, where it had earned a reputation as an elite, experienced unit. Surprisingly, a combat patrol returned one day with a man riding a small DKW motorcycle painted khaki, the same machine bearing the emblem of my reconnaissance battalion. I examined it closely. The vehicle had traversed a miniature safari, having been captured earlier by the British in North Africa, transported to England, and now, unexpectedly, reappearing in our hands. After retrieving the item from that location, I directed my forces to Normandy, where they successfully recaptured it and returned it to me without damage. Meanwhile, on the nights of June 7th and 8th, two formidable panzer divisions, the Panzer Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, had finally reached the front lines, following grueling and significant marches from their regrouping areas, far to the east and south of Calais. These divisions were promptly thrown into intense counterattacks and fierce defensive operations west of Calais in an effort to repel the Allied advance. However, after enduring relentless assaults from the Royal Air Force, both divisions had suffered severe losses and became increasingly demoralized. Their strength was so diminished that they could no longer mount any meaningful offense against the bridgeheads to the west of Calais, leaving them effectively stalled and unable to make further progress.